Okay, for the next video here, what I've done is I've actually opened up a file where I had at least an object into it, because we're going to talk a little bit about these windows, these drop downs that you see up here in the preview window. And I kind of need to have something here um, to show you some of the areas that we need to talk about. So I've just basically just imported a box and I've dropped it in here, and you'll see I've also got some things down below. We'll talk about those too. So what we have up over here on the left-hand side controls what we see in this window and how this preview window works. So this little triangle at the very beginning over here allows us to see some basic elements, things like your frame rate. Frame rate is a good thing to keep an eye on when you're working. Most games like to stay up in the 60 frames a second range, and it's hard to tell sometimes exactly where you are. So if you just go down and check that button, it'll show you your frame rate, and there it is over here. As I move my mouse around, it's showing me 60 frames a second. So that's about the maximum that I'm going to get out of this one, and it works out pretty well for what I need to do. It also is warning me my lighting needs to be rebuilt, and I talked a little bit about that in the past video. We're just going to ignore that for right now. Perspective. This is my perspective view. Now, it's not the only view that's in here. Obviously, I can work in a variety of views. It used to be that you had all four windows up here. Almost all 3D programs, whether they be 3D modeling, Maya or Max or Blender or any of those 3D modeling programs, and almost all of the game engines will show you a variety of views. And they almost always have the four views up there and ready to go. And those are top, left, right, and usually a side. All right. Excuse me. You got top, left, right, which are your sides, and then I have a choice of bottom or front, or I can stick with perspective on these things. Now, these are useful when you're trying to place objects in a scene. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult when you're looking at it like this, and you go, "Well, is that box actually sitting on the ground?" Well, I can zoom in on this thing, and I can get down really close to see whether or not that's sitting on the ground. And I have to assume that it is, because I've built that thing and I know exactly where my pivot point is located on the original model, and it did bring it in and drop it right on the ground. But sometimes if you've got something from somebody else, a model from somebody else, or you didn't pay attention to that, you don't know exactly whether or not something is sitting on the ground. Well, by switching your views, let's say going to the left view, it changes to wireframe, and what I can do is I can zoom in here and I can see there is a wireframe version. There is the ground plane, which is this orange box right here. And then there is my object that I've modeled right there, that box, and it is actually sitting right on the ground. So I know that that's good. So this allows me to look at it that way. Or I can look at it from the bottom, or I can look at it from the top, or I can look at it from the left, I can look at it from the front. Any of these views will allow me to see it, and then when I'm done, I can go back to my perspective, and I know that everything is lined like it's supposed to be. So this is really kind of helpful when you need to go in and do things. So you can't really see all four of them anymore, but you can go in. Actually, I guess you can. You can go in here and you can minimize or restore that viewport, and you can bring them back up. But for the most part, I usually keep this one here at full screen and then just use the other ones as necessary. All right, that's that little tiny box up here in the right-hand corner. We'll swap it down to four views. I'm working in a ridiculously small space, and I really only need to see one of those at a time to know whether something is aligned, so I just call them up as I need them. And the one that you click becomes the one that goes back to full frame. Now, this next one over here has to do with your lighting. And this is an important one to look at here for a moment, because this really takes up a lot of memory. I am looking at this world as lit, which means it is showing me all of the shadows and everything. I'm seeing things actually look three-dimensional, like I can see my shadows underneath the box. I can see some shadows up here on top. It's very nice. It's great to be able to see that. But strictly speaking, if I've modeled something correctly, and I've gotten it all taken care of the way I needed to do it, and I've got my lighting correct, I really don't need to see those shadows. If I change this to unlit, you can see that everything goes flat. I don't really see any shadows anymore. But the shadows really aren't important to me because I'm not really concerned about them right now. And this uses a tremendously less amount of memory. to keep this thing set to unlit. So if you're having trouble with it, you might want to maybe set that to unlit. You can always check it by going back to lit, and you can see there are shortcut keys there, Alt-4 and Alt-3. You can jump back and forth between those, and you can check something out. But once you get used to working in 3D, this becomes unnecessary, and it does take up a lot of memory because it's got to calculate all the shadows and display them correctly, and that's a lot. So I usually keep things as unlit. There's also wireframe. You remember we looked at the left, right, front, top. Those are all in wireframe. That's handled through here. Excuse me. Wireframe, I can see this in wireframe too if I want to. It's a little hard to see what's going on. When you click on an object, it becomes activated so you can see it. But, excuse me, the problem with this is you can accidentally click on something else, like that ginormous sky dome. This is that ginormous sky dome. And when I say ginormous, I really can't even tell you how big it is. If I go in here and look at my top view and I zoom out, there we go. You can see how big that dome is all the way around my little teeny tiny world right in through here. It is huge. So it's the problem that I have is it's too hard to make sure you're selecting the things you want to. So I usually try not to go into wireframe unless I absolutely have to. There's some other lighting ones in here, like detail lighting. This is designed to show you, like, you look at it and go, well, where'd my textures go? Well, the textures aren't the important part of this. This is showing you the detail lighting. The details in this particular case are the shadows. Now, we're going to talk about shadows a little bit more later on, and how shadows are generated and what this actually is. It looks like, you know, we're used to the real world, and if I shine a light on an object, a shadow is what occurs. But these aren't real world objects. They're not real lights. And so when you see a shadow on the ground, that shadow has to be computed somehow, some way, and projected on the floor. So what this is showing me is where that detail lighting is going, and I can also use this to judge how complicated my textures are going to be, which is the same as these other ones down here, light complexity. Now, everything changes in here, and the colors are based upon how much memory or how much processing power is being utilized by a particular light or a particular effect that you're trying to do. It doesn't really make much sense now. If we have a really big scene with a lot of different things in there, you'll really see it. Shader complexity, the same thing. All right, this is having to do with how light interacts with the material. There's really a simple material on here that's easy to use. This one's a little bit more complicated because there actually is a false material on there, so that's why we're getting a different value of color. And then the sky dome around here and that box have about the same complexity, which is not very complex at all. We also have stationary light overlapping. We only have one light in this room, so we're not getting overlapping lights. When we get into lights, we'll talk about how that can affect the way you see things. There is such a thing as too many lights in a scene. They've done a nice job with this program setting it up. So if you're dealing with lights, you use the minimal lights that you need to have to get the maximum effect. So it's really kind of a nice touch in there. Light map density. Again, shows you just how complex things are compared to other things in the scene and how they interact with one another. Reflections, there are some reflections going on in here. There is a reflection dome right here. This is what is controlling some reflections. And so you're seeing basically if an object would be shiny, what it actually would be showing off in reflections. So you can do that one. Collision, player collisions, it's what the object is, the player is going to collide with. You notice there's no box here. That's because there is no collision on that box. And that's why I set it up that way. Visibility collision, you can see there's something that I would bump into visually, but there really is no way for me to, I could actually walk right through that thing. In fact, if I go in, I won't do that now, but I could go in and fly around and fly right through that box. There's no collision on that. So I'm going to go back up here to lit. All right, show. That if you're working in a complicated world and you're working in a real world environment, which means it is as big as you think it is. So if you're dealing with 4 square miles, it is 4 square miles in here, and that's a lot of foliage, a lot of rocks, a lot of buildings, a lot of things that you may not need to see. So you can go in here and you can turn various things on or off to help save some memory. and we'll go through some of these as we go through a particular level. I will be taking advantage of this in here to show you how to save some memory on some of the files that we're working on, but that's kind of what's happening there. Now the important parts for me are over here on the right. Okay, we have select and translate objects, we have select and rotate objects, we have select and scale objects. So if I want to select, if I click on an object and I want to move it with these pivot points, that is what is selected first. If I would like to rotate it, I click on this one and I get a rotational tool that allows me to rotate an object in increments, in degree increments. Okay. If I wanted to scale a tool, I'm going to get this one. It is also going to scale in increments. So it's going to snap up or down depending upon what it is I want it to do. Now we'll talk about scaling. When we get into assets, we'll talk about scaling because you are limited in what you can scale and how you can scale it. Rotating and moving, not really a problem. Scaling can be a problem depending upon what you're importing. So we'll talk about that later on. Now, another way to control that is the space bar on your keyboard. If you would like to cycle through them, it's just clicking your space bar. And that's a great shortcut for you to do things. You want to rotate it, do that. You want to move it again, just double click on your space bar, and then you can grab it and you can move it. All right. The next one shows you a little globe. It determines whether or not something is local or whether something is based on the world. Now, there's just a single object here, so we're just going to go with, in this particular case, it's just going to be global. We're moving things globally, and that's what's happening right there. Now, these over here are your snaps. And I'm running out of time here, but we have a snap to grid, which is what this is, and the settings here, I can snap it in any one of these increments. And in fact, there are a couple of different ways that I can do it. I can change this. Depends upon the 3D program you're exporting from, and we'll talk about that later on when we get to importing assets. There is a snap to rotation, and there is a snap to scale. You need to make sure that these all remain on, because when you start to take objects, and if you wanted to, create you want to take one of these and you want to create a second one and you want them to butt up against one another, that snap tool is going to be really handy when you're trying to line up pieces of a building. You're going to want the pieces to snap to each other end to end so they don't overlap, and we'll talk more about that. You don't want overlapping. Overlapping is going to give you what we call Z-fighting. That's what that looks like. It's because the program doesn't know which of those two objects you want to see. They're taking up the same space. You want to make sure that these remain on at all times. I change them quite frequently, but then I always make sure that they remain on. If I need really fine movements, instead of 10 snaps, maybe I want that to be a lot closer, I can go in and set that down to 1, and then it feels like there's no snap to it, but there actually is. And then once I get it to butt up against each other, I'll just set it back to 10. The same thing with rotation. I can take it down to 5. I can do it in 10-degree increments. I can do it in like 90-degree increments of the divisions of a 360-degree circle, things like that. And then scaling, the same thing. I can do that. And this is great because you can select everything in a scene and scale everything up or down. For instance, you've built something in a 3D program, or you've got something from a 3D program. You bring it in, and it's ginormous. And you built an entire environment, and you go to play it, and your player is minuscule compared to your environment. You can select your entire environment, and you can scale it all down together. It'll snap, so it all comes down together, and it all stays put together, so you don't have to worry about things separating out. And then you can do it that way. Or if you look and you go, oh look, I had to take something, and I had to make it fit. I had to go in and I had to scale it down 10% twice. All right. Well, then it tells me that everything I bring in from that same program, I'm going to have to do the same thing with. The last little bit over here that I'm going to show you is the camera speed. This has to do with zooming in and out. It is set to 4. If I take this and I take it down to 1, my mouse moves very slowly. If I take this and I set that back up to about 8, then I zoom in and out very quickly. Again, depending upon the size of your environment, moving around quickly might be a big thing. For the most part, I keep that set at 4, and it's a nice, easy thing. If you find you're dealing with little objects and you're zooming in too much, then you just go back up and you change that. All right, in the next video, I'm going to talk about your content browser down here and what I have going on.